I thank the organizers for inviting me to hold this lecture. As you know, this year we are celebrating 500 years since the death of Raphael, and many planned meetings and exposition are now stopped because of the COVID emergency, but we hope to go back to celebrations as soon as possible. So we can begin with a statement. Talking about Raphael means talking about one of the most important painters that the world has ever had. Giorgio Vasari, the first biographer of the artist, as well as the first enthusiastic biographer of Michelangelo, despite the desire to place Michelangelo at the peak of an historical reconstruction that saw the history of painters, sculptors, and architects as a parable, culminate with Michelangelo and then descend from there towards the decadence, had to acknowledge. E nel vero che l'altre pitture nominare si possono, ma quelle di Raffaello cose vive, perché trema la carne, vedesi lo spirito, battono i sensi alle figure sue, e vivacità viva vi si scorge. We can translate that the paintings of other artists can be called paintings, but those of Raphael can be called living things, because the flesh trembles, the spirit becomes visible, the senses beat in his figures, and lively vivacity can be seen there. When Vasari wrote these words, Raphael had been dead for a few decades, and some of his pupils had been active in the major work sites of the Italian states. In Mantova, you know very well the precious result of this moving, given the capital work of architecture and painting that Giulio Romano, moving from Rome, left there in Mantova. On the one hand, this is the end of the story of Raphael, but on the other, it is the beginning of the transformation of Raphael into a model and finally into a myth. This is the path we are going to follow today, in order to consider the complex figure of Raphael, not only for what he did during his career, but for what he represented, in particular for artists, in the following centuries. For these reasons, we are going to briefly recall his path to trace the critical fortune of this artist. As everyone knows, Raphael was born in Urbino in 1483. His father, Giovanni Santi, was a painter perfectly inserted in the artistic life of Montefeltro's erudite court. We don't have certain documents about the training of Raphael, and scholars have long questioned the veracity of Vasari's claims that declare him a pupil of the painter Perugino. During Raphael's early years, Perugino was certainly the most famous artist in his town. Therefore, it is not surprising to find in his young works many solicitations of this figurative culture. This period was the focus of an important exhibition curated by Barbara Agosti and Silvia Ginsburg, held a few months ago in the Galleria Nazionale delle Marche. We find in Raphael's work a resemblance to Perugino in the arrangement of the figures, as you can see here in this slide, in the composition of the wall, in the way of spreading the colors, in the chromatic range, in the way of draping, but also in landscape. It starts from here, Raphael's transition to the modern manner. Let's consider, for example, his Marriage of the Virgin, painted in 1504 for the Albizzi Chapel in the Church of San Francisco in Città di Castello, and now in Brera in Milan. This painting is strictly related to the fresco you see on the right, the fresco Perugino had executed in the Sistine Chapel in 1481-82, which is an icon of the Italian Renaissance painting, thanks to the prospectical research, the care in reconstructions of antiquities, and the part-active arrangement of the figures inherited from ancient reliefs. Raphael's altarpiece is a sort of zoomed vision of Perugino's invention, a vision in which the mathematical, symbolic, and perspective world of the Renaissance plays a fundamental role, and the search for truthfulness that will make Raphael the one who will make the flesh of the characters depicted tremble, like Vasari said, is only at the beginning. The great ability ascribed to Raphael since his contemporaries is that of grasping and connecting the previous artistic experiences, but also the current ones, to assimilate them and then elaborate them in a new language, which the architect and theorist Sebastiano Serlio already defined in 1545 as universalissimo. We can say very universal. This was considered a great merit in the literary field, and it was a teaching that came from antiquity and that is found, for example, in the writings of the humanist Angelo Poliziano. Also in this aspect, so a spirit of Renaissance erudition should be found in Raphael. One of the main sources for the growth of Raphael and for his path towards the naturalness, that grace and that unsurpassed ability to make visible the sentimental motions of the figures is Leonardo. One can observe this very well, especially through the Madonnas painted by Raphael during and after his Florentine stay around 1506. As we can find out observing the Madonna del Cardellino, made in Florence between around 1506, the pyramidal construction, the harmonious insertion into the landscape, but above all the tenderness that binds mother and child, are the results of Leonardo's legacy, that Raphael reworks in a less initiatory language, a language that we could define for everyone. Simplifying, it can be said that Leonardo's research started from the scientific observation of nature, as you know, and returned it in the paintings, while that of Raphael was an aesthetic research, which from nature selected the best parts and reunited them in an ideal image that referred to nature, but that did not imitate it directly. The category we have to put in place is that of the ideal beauty. That is to say, a beauty that does not exist in nature as a whole, but which is composed in the artist's idea, in the artist's mind, through the union of selected parts of nature. It is a philosophical concept very important for Raphael that evolves from the 16th century onwards and which has its roots in the classical studies that attributed the first explanation of this method to the Greek artist Zeusi. The ideal beauty will be for centuries in various forms a beacon for classicist sculptors, and Raphael immediately becomes a preeminent representative of this ability to build the ideal beauty. The feeling that Mary must express, according to the gospel narrative, is that of an affectionate mother worried about the written fate of her son, for whom the bird offered by little John becomes the symbol of martyrdom, but also of a mother who accepts with faith that destiny because she knows that it is necessary for the salvation of humanity. In the quiet contemporary Bridgewater Madonna, one can see how Raphael reflected on Michelangelo's model for the freedom of movement of the child, which gives the group a lively twist. However, Raphael's research seems to have the purpose to express the strong sentimental and psychological link between mother and child, united by love and common destiny, which is tragic on the human level, but noble and necessary on the divine level. The evolution of Raphael's art towards increasingly natural effects will keep these points intact. The comparison between these two slides, as well this one and this one, as well as detecting the coherence of the evolution of Raphael's work, allows us to highlight the strong gap between a culture closed to the great models of the Umbrian and Tuscan First Renaissance, with a strong design matrix and a highly geometric attention to the composition, and a new culture founded on a new balance between drawing and color, and which, while preserving the perspective and geometric rules, masks them and makes them less visible, leaving in the foreground a pleasantness, grace, and naturalness that show us the modern manner. The dialogue between the characters depicted, made explicit by their gestures, and the psychological ties characterize Raphael's research and mark the evolution of his art also in the altarpieces. This is the so-called Foligno Madonna, which actually depicts a holy conversation with the, you see Madonna and Child in the upper register, and in the lower one, St. John the Baptist and Francisco on the left, and the commissioner of the altarpiece, Sigismondo Conti, with St. Jerome, his protector, on the right. The altarpiece takes its name from the location in which the monastery of the Countesses in Foligno was moved in 1565, but it is actually a work made for Santa Maria in Araceli in Rome, and precisely the first Roman altarpiece by Raphael, made around 1511. We can recognize in the Madonna and in the Child those features now developed by Raphael that we observed in the smaller Madonnas, the Child in motion with the twisted body that reminds us Michelangelo Tondodoni that you can see there. And this Child, as we have seen before, partly restrained and partly exposed by his mother. And she is characterized by a thoughtful and tender look. We can also recognize that now perfect development of the harmonic balance between characterization of faces and idealized faces inspired by the ancient. What is most striking, if compared to his previous works, is the landscape, whose soft, natural, and color rendering has undergone a drastic change. Even the landscape, through a different use of color, becomes more natural, as you can see in these details. We'll come back to this topic later, but now I want to complete our short journey through Raphael's Madonna with a work that constitutes one of the great legacies of the master from Urbino to the so-called Baroque culture, the Sistine Madonna. This altarpiece is no more a holy conversation, but it is an appearance to the spectator, to whom Mary and the Child turn their eyes, revealing themselves in a golden light, like in a theater, at the opening of the green curtains. We cannot understate the contribution of this work to the 17th century culture of the so-called Baroque. The psychological bond and effective understanding that in the previous picture linked mother and son now also concerns the observer, who becomes part of that conversation made up of looks and gestures, and it is a participant witness of the sacrifice of this mother and this son for humanity. And so human, in fact, appear both mother and child. But what had happened to Raphael during this period? He had moved to Rome. Here, starting from 1508, Raphael had the opportunity to study ancient statuary, to be among the first to learn about decorative painting called grotesque, to see Michelangelo's Roman work, and to create his largest and most monumental works in the service of the popes. We cannot delve into this topic today, but we must take into consideration the importance of the school of Raphael, of the pupils that allowed him to fulfill many requests, who brought his works to completion after his death, and who spread his language from Rome to other artistic centers, above all Giulio Romano and Gianfrancesco Penni. The presence of so good and so well-educated pupils nearby the master has led to many problems of attribution of the works by modern criticism. For centuries, art historians have argued, quarreled to establish the autography of drawings and paintings. This is a modern problem. So when we talk about Raphael's critical fortune, we'll have to take into consideration the fact that until the 19th century, most of the works that are today attributed to this or that pupil were considered in all respects of the master. The major decorative ventures of Raphael and his workshop in Rome were the Farnesina Lodge, the Vatican Lodges, and the Vatican Rooms. These cycles have become cornerstones for following generation of artists who would have been inspired by these scenes for centuries. The variety of compositional expedients, styles, techniques developed by Raphael and his school in these sites would in fact have enabled everyone at all times to find a peculiar and always different source of inspiration in these works. This is not a fact that concerns only painters, but it's a fact that at certain moments in the history of taste influences the entire concept of settings. I mean, in these cases, the master's great ability did not concern only the composition of the figured scenes, the style, and all the other characteristics of his painting, always evoluting, which we talked about. In this case, it was primarily a question of organizing the available architectural space and imagining how to transform this space into a support for the unfolding of a narrative cycle. For this reason, although they usually have much less prominence in the treatments relating to Raphael's frescoes, the decorative parties which frame the stories and which allow architecture to accompany the narration also assume a fundamental value. Let's take, for example, the Raphael Lodge, the second lodge in the Vatican Apostolic Palace, or more precisely, from whom Raphael gave the theme and provided the drawings. The lodge runs along the whole east side for a length of about 65 meters, and it's about 4 wide. It is divided into 13 small spans covered by a pavilion vault. All the pillars and the walls of the closest side have a stucco and fresco decoration with grotesque figures linked to mythological themes or contemporary events, but also the reproduction of famous works of art. Under each vault, there are 4 frescoed stories surrounded by stucco frames, hexagonal or rectangular or arched, while at the corners there are grotesque or architectural decoration. The first 12 vaults have stories from the Old Testament and the last from the New Testament. Now I show you some of these vaults in order that you can imagine the myriad of compositional ideas that these scenes may have represented for the artists of the following generation, but also to show how the coexistence of different hands of different painters, which are not noticeable in the style, did not affect the overall effect imagined and designed by the master. These are some stories, Moses stories. And please remind these stories because we will see them again. But the logis represented Raphael's great legacy, especially as regards the organization of the decorative space, as well as an infinite repertoire of decorative forms inspired by a faithful knowledge and restitution of the natural and animal world, which is mainly due to the hand of Giovanni da Udine and Perin del Vaga. That's why one of Raphael's works, most important scholar, Professor Antonio Paolucci, considers this as the greatest legacy, the real legacy of Raphael. But let's go back to the beginning of Raphael's Roman stay. Raphael's work in the Vatican rooms, in Italian Stanze Vaticane, begins in 1508 in the Stanza della Segnatura, completed in 1511, where the painter Sodoma was working on the decoration of the ceiling, in which Raphael will perform the allegorical figures of theology, philosophy, law, and poetry. Originally, this room was used by Pope Julius II as a library. The iconographic program of the frescoes is linked to this function. The first frescoes to be executed are the School of Athens and the Dispute of the Sacrament. And here you say, obviously, the School of Athens. The theme of philosophy is represented through a gathering of the major thinkers of antiquity and modernity, in which the preeminent position is given to Plato and Aristotle. The scene is set in a monumental classical architecture inspired by the work of Bramante, friend of Raphael and first architect of Pope Julius II, who perhaps collaborated with the painter from Urbino, like him, in the design of this architectural setting. This became an icon of Roman classicism, in which the study of ancient statuary, its monumentality, its typified and rhetorical poses, was revitalized in a new language capable of responding to the needs of the mature humanists of the papal court. The gestures and attributes with which the philosophers are depicted are the result of a cultured erudition, all referring to the main points of their thought. What Raphael makes in this fresco is a parade of models, of human types, of heads, of faces, of eloquent poses, of draping that will constitute one of his greatest testaments. We cannot analyze the frescoes one by one, but I want to show some photos from which you can observe how this construction site bears visible traces of the evolution of the Raphael style in relation also to the theme we have spoken of, that is his ability to observe the works of other artists and to update himself. The second room to be depicted was the so-called Heliodorus room, executed between 1511 and 1514, that takes its name from the scene representing the expulsion of Heliodorus from the temple. As the critics have always noticed, it is possible to observe in a clear way the influence of Michelangelo's work on this fresco. There is a story reported by the aforementioned Vasari, which explains how Raphael was brought by his friend Bramante in secret to observe the work still in progress by Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel. We mean the paintings of the vault made by the great sculptor and painter by 1512. That is while Raphael was working on these frescoes. We don't know, here you can see a detail of Michelangelo's vault. We don't know if Vasari's story is true, but it is certain that the vision of this Michelangelo's work strongly influenced Raphael's manner, as it is evident from the group on the right side of the Eliodoro painting, where the vigorous and statuesque muscles, the extremely twisted poses, and the violent expressiveness of the characters disclosed the influence of Michelangelo. This sort of mixed manner, Raphael and Michelangelo manner that blend these two big artists, it's a fundamental precedent for the experiences of mannerism. Less known and less considered until the last restoration of Raphael's Vatican frescoes conducted by Paolo Violini under the direction of Arnold Nesserat is Raphael's closeness to Titian's painting. As you know, Titian was the master of Venetian color, and the use of color in this fresco that we can now see thanks to the cleaning, to the restoration, has removed any doubt about the fact that such a thorough knowledge of Titian paintings, but also of his fresco technique, cannot be explained except with a journey by Raphael into Veneto, on dates not yet clarified, but certainly before the execution of this work. Since the 16th century, artistic literature has established a competition between Venetianism and pictorial experiences more linked to the solidity of drawing, giving Raphael as well as Michelangelo the role of masters of this second path. It is therefore very important to go back to look these frescoes with a new awareness of how many and what pictorial experiences the great genius of Raphael was able to observe and blend. And here you can see some detail that shows that this is a sort of touch painting. Even the young Gianlorenzo Bernini, realizing the sculptural group of Aeneas and Anchises conserved in Villa Borghese, will be inspired by Raphael Borgo Fire. The last work of Raphael, perhaps even completed by his students, certainly the last touched by his brush before the premature death of Raphael, represents a further moment of comparison with the great masters of his time. This is the Transfiguration commissioned by Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, future Pope Clement VII, in 1516 for the Cathedral of Narbonne. As the sources testify in a rather precise way, also thanks to Michelangelo's correspondence, the Cardinal fostered a competition by simultaneously commissioning another altarpiece to Sebastiano Luciani, known as Sebastiano del Piombo, a Venetian artist very close to Michelangelo, Michelangelo helped Sebastiano through advices and preparatory drawings for some parts of the painting, two of which now in the British Museum of London and that you can see here. Harassed by the competition with Sebastiano, which is, however, for Raphael a competition with Michelangelo, Raphael resorted to his greater ability, that of knowing how to seize the best from the languages of the other masters and how to render it with ease and immediacy not common to the other geniuses of this time. In a strategic move in conceiving this painting, he returns to drink from Leonardo's source. Leonardo has spent a few years in Rome, hosted by the Cardinal, who was now commissioning the two altarpieces, and the altarpiece's destination was in France, where Leonardo had moved in the same 1516 in the service of the king. The reference to Leonardo, to his table with the adoration of the Magi, that Raphael had studied so much when he was in Florence, and to the other graphic works that Raphael had surely been able to admire in the Roman years of the Tuscan master, is not only the pronounced characterization of some faces, or in that exhibited gestures of the hands and the arms, which becomes a narrative thread, and which we particularly appreciate in the Last Supper that you can see here. These are immediate quotes, but the intelligent way, the smart way that Raphael find to fill the master's research wins in his favor against Michelangelo and Sebastiano in this race concerns the way of making the relief of the bodies. To the statuesque solidity with which Michelangelo's design creates the bodies, although interpreted by an artist who comes from a culture related to color like Sebastiano, Raphael contrasts the marked chiaroscuro transition of Leonardo's derivation. In the lower part of the painting that you see here, in fact, the solidity of the bodies is created just by the transition between lights and shadows. Lights and shadows model shapes much more than drawing. Raphael proves capable of interpreting in an apical way the tools that the actual pictorial culture offers him once again. Soon after the master's death, Raphael's pupils pursued their careers by exporting that language that included Raphael's legacy, but also mindful of Michelangelo's lesson. Raphael's work had already enjoyed while he was already closed while he was living, and it had a great diffusion thanks to the practice of engraving, starting from the engravings made by Marcantonio Raimondi, who collaborated directly with Raphael and Giulio Romano. The artists had a clear understanding of the fundamental role of the engravings for the promotion of their art. Of course, the engravings from the great frescoes of Raphael, which could not always be copied directly, were a fundamental tool for the study of generations. Marcantonio Raimondi, after the triumph of Galatea, of Raphael, so we take a look at the Farnesina Lodge that we didn't see before. But engravings were a fundamental tool not only for artists. If we consider that Tsarina Catherine II fell in love with the Raphael Lodge through the engravings by Giovanni Volpato that also circulated in Russia, unable to visit Rome, she commissioned the architect Giacomo Quarenghi the architecture suitable for hosting a one-to-one copy of the entire decoration of the lodge in the Hermitage Winter Palace, while the painter Cristoforo Unterberger directed in Rome a team of painters that made the copies of the frescoes, with the result you can see here in this photo, and you can see in Petersburg as well. Studying and copying Raphael's work became as important as studying and copying ancient sculpture for artists coming to Rome from all over Europe. We preserve lots of drawing executed from his altarpieces and frescoes and drawings as well, made by artists in every time. That's because of the universality that made him to become a model for everyone, because everyone could find something useful for his research in Raphael's work. One of the places where Raphael's statue was developed as the supreme model for artistic training were of course the academies of art, and in particular the Roman ones. As you know, when I talk about academies in Rome, I mean above all the Accademia di San Luca, association of artists born at in the late 16th century, with the aim of promoting the artistic professions, first that of painter, but also then of sculptor and architects, and the French Academy in Rome, founded in 1666. This painting, traditionally attributed to Raphael, became the icon, the symbol of the Accademia di San Luca in Rome. As you can see, it represents Saint Luke, that, according to legend, was the first to paint the Virgin thanks to her apparition. Present in the institution at least since the 80s of the 16th century, in an unpublished iconography, Raphael is standing next to the saint as if were learning to paint from him. This is not the occasion when we will discuss the attribution of this painting, which some scholars still believe to be autographs, and which many others, including myself, believe instead to be the result of a wonderful ideological operation carried out by academicians of the second half of the 16th century. What matters for our speech today is to observe how the official association of Roman artists chose Raphael as guide, as tutelary deity, alongside him with the patron saint of painters. In fact, we must consider how the academies were not only a place where art was taught, and from this point of view, the suggestion given to young students was clear: follow Raphael, but also a place for social promotion of the professions, as I told you. And so the prestige achieved in life by Raphael also became an example, a model to follow. In other words, placing themselves under the protection of Raphael meant for the artists indicating the importance of their work and the important genealogy of the Roman pictorial school. Also, and especially for this reason, the painting was engraved by many artists, and very often these prints were dedicated to important patrons of the academies or of the arts. It served to remind them of the importance of the social role of the artist. Here you can see 3 examples of 3 engravings from this altarpiece. And the first one, as you see, is dedicated to Cardinal Francesco Barberini, that was Accademia di San Luca's patron. The second one has an inscription that is a defense of the profession of painter. And the third one is dedicated to Jean-Baptiste Colbert, that was the state secretary of King Louis XVI, and he was the patron of the French Academy in Rome. As you can imagine, this ideal address of the Roman Academy is also found in teaching, where, for example, on the occasion of the prize competitions for young aspiring artists, a copy of Raphael's works was often requested. These represented together an indispensable exercise for the training and a demonstration of having acquired technical skills, as we can see in this drawing that perhaps you will recognize them, are copies from some scenes of the lodge that we have seen before. It is a sort of reciprocal service. While the prestigious figure of Raphael guarantees academic artists to affirm their social role, the institution, with its functioning, its public ceremonies, and its publications, contributes strongly to the construction of the myth of the artist from Urbino. In fact, we must not forget that the increase in artistic literature gave rise to wide-ranging debates in which Raphael's work was not always considered unsurpassed due to the changed taste, but also for political and strategic reasons. When King Louis XVI, through Jean-Baptiste Colbert, envying the Roman artistic heritage, founded the Academy of France in Rome, the French Academy in Rome, where painters, sculptors, and architects were hosted, pensionnaires of the king, in order to train themselves on Roman models. They were engaged full-time in copying Raphael's major works, starting right from the Vatican rooms. On the one hand, to improve their technique, but on the other side, to send copies to the king. If in the letters of these early years it emerges very well how Raphael's model was considered superior, over time the need for autonomy of part of French artists found support in a renewed French ideological vision. Thanks to the new formulation of the artistic literature on the one hand, and to the desire to assert its political power by the king on the other hand, slowly by the French, a policy of downsizing the role and myth of Raphael was implemented in favor of a national artistic genealogy that saw its progenitor in Poussin. Of course, we must not think that the French artists who stayed in Rome stopped copying Raphael, because this never happened. But the new generations of artists during the 18th century began to judge the trip to Rome for their training as no longer essential. Defending Raphael, therefore, meant for Roman academicians also defending the role of Rome as a universal center of the arts. An exhibition that will open, we hope, in September in Rome, in Palazzo Carpegna, curated by the General Secretary of the Accademia di San Luca, Francesco Moschini, by Valeria Rotili and by myself, will be dedicated to the role of the Roman Academy in the construction and diffusion of the myth of Raphael, and so you all are invited. If we analyze the main personalities of artists in Rome between the 18th and 19th centuries, we can easily observe how much Raphael's model influenced their art. This is, of course, an issue deeply intertwined with the artistic literature and aesthetic theories, which we are not able to deal with today. Let's just take a look at some examples which allow us to observe how the declinations of the Raphaelite model were very always different and always new. Starting from Annibale Carracci, which was soon defined in particular by the scholar and antiquarian Giovan Pietro Bellori, the new Raphael, for the quality of his painting expressed in a masterly way in the Farnese Gallery that you see here, but also precisely for his ability to combine and merge different pictorial languages, the Antiquity, the Venetian masters, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Correggio above all. Maybe the most important painter of the late 17th century in Rome was Carlo Maratti, of which the biographer Leone Pascoli wrote that no painter had greater reverence for Raphael than him. In a complex and articulated artistic culture that is updated according to the needs of its time, reminiscent of the experience of the Carraccis and their Emilian schools transplanted to Rome, such as Guido Reni or Domenichino, the memory of Raphael's studio will always be very lively in the art of Maratti. Defined in his yacht Carluccio delle Madonne for the applause earned by his Madonnas, in which that search for tenderness reaches its peak, Maratti will also be declared the new Raphael of his time. He was also the author of very important restorations on Raphael capital works, the Farnesina Lodge and the Vatican Rooms, operation that animated a strong debate. Raphael's fortune and the different variation that this fortune has assumed over time can be studied in a very useful way through the history of restoration. We have no way of dealing with it today, but I'm pleased to mention this aspect because the history of restoration is a fundamental tool for analyzing diachronic reception of an artist's work. On the restoration of Raphael's works, there are important contributions from scholars such as Bruno Zanardi, Rosaria Varoli, Michela Di Macco, and of course, Paolo Violini, who, as I said, last restored the Raphael rooms. The history of art abounds with new Raphaels, and this is very significant, very important. And here is another one, Anton Raphael Mengs, who with his Parnassus realized in Villa Albani in Rome in 1761, again shows the importance of Raphael's Vatican rooms in the cultural background of the artistic of the artists active in Rome. Here with Mengs, we are in a moment of strong affirmation of antiquarian studies in a philological way, also due to the findings of the archaeological sites of Pompeii and Herculaneum, and the major references of the culture of Mengs were certainly linked to the ancient statues, as evidenced by his Apollo, modeled on the famous Apollo del Belvedere preserved in the Vatican that you see here on the right. Despite this, the reference to Raphael remains clear, sure, deliberately clear for an artist who approached himself to the great master of the 16th century and who made of the ideal beauty the pivotal concept of his art. A fundamental moment that marks Raphael's extraordinary fortune is the Napoleonic expoliation, when the French army took the master's major works from Italian churches and collections and constituted one of the great pride of the new and public Louvre Museum. It is no coincidence that the watercolor that you see here that show a moment of the Imperial's wedding procession in 1810 shows this parade under the greatest works of Raphael, from the Transfiguration, you can see very well, to the Madonna di Foligno we saw before, to Santa Cecilia and other works. Owning and exposing Raphael altarpieces was considered a trophy amongst trophies. We followed briefly, I have to say, the updating of Raphael's art and the accomplished change in his painting after his transfer to Rome and his encounter with Michelangelo's work. Well, just this range of different possibilities that the imitation of Raphael could entail gave rise at the beginning of the 19th century to a radical distinction between the Raphael before Rome and the Raphael after Rome. In an aesthetic vision that saw in art after Raphael a decline, and above all in a strongly Christian vision that saw in the ancient model the risk of corruption of the Christian meaning of the works, of images, and in Michelangelo's model the danger of an art too intellectual, lent itself to the diffusion of a clear, limpid, unchangeable and undisputable doctrine. It was the first Raphael to be indicated as the best example for refounding contemporary art. Of this opinion was, for example, Tommaso Minardi, the main representative artist in Rome of the Purist movement. Here you see Madonna from Minardi, dated 1940, so very late if we observe it. It is an artistic position that has been considered a rearguard, but like many contemporary experiences also in architecture, it was a return to the origins. Minardi, who was the last great master of pontifical Rome, returned to the primitives that were the artists before Raphael, and to the first Raphael by delivering an update reflection on these models, which is a sign of his time and of a cultural climate that, although it may not meet modern taste and maybe aesthetically less attractive than other experiences of that moment, has its own modernity. No artist like Raphael has happened to be the subject of many and different reincarnations, as we have seen. Here we stop our gallery of images aimed at demonstrating how the gaze of the artist has constantly settled on Raphael, always seeking and finding new things in his work. Because I would like to close with an aspect more tied to the construction of his myth in relation to the episodes of his life. In the romantic paintings of the beginning of the 19th century, when representing episodes of his life, of Raphael's life, became a real fashion, as Fernando Mazzocca recently wrote in occasion of the exhibition Raphael and the Echo of the Myth held in Bergamo 2 years ago. In parallel with the publication of many learned Raphael's lives, the most famous of which is Histoire de la vie et de l'ouvrage de Raphaël, written by the famous theorist Antoine Chrysostome Quatremer de Quincy and published in 1824, there is gradually a popular diffusion of this subject throughout the century. One can understand how the fictional life of this artist, who had risen to the greatest glories, had worked for the main courts, had died regret from all the cultural world of his time, and last but not least, at last, according to the legend, he had been involved in life by a deep love relationship with Margherita Luti, so-called Fornarina, who is traditionally identified with the woman portrayed in the painting preserved in Palazzo Barberini in Rome. On the other hand, the prestige assumed in life by Raphael echoed for the 19th century artists who lived great political and social upheavals, a moment of great fortune in the artistic profession, and also for these reasons, the many reflections by romantic artists on his life. In 1816, Franz and Christian von Rippenhausen published in Frankfurt a collection of 12 engraved plates illustrating the highlights of Sanzio's life. This was called Leben Raphael Sanzios von Urbino. Each plate had a short caption, and above all, each plate was designed to glorify the figure of this painter. And here we see 6 of these 12 plates, and you can see starting from upper left, you can see the birth of Raphael, and then Raphael as a child prodigy in his parents' house. Then in the third plate, Raphael took from his father to Perugino's workshop to learn painting. And then Raphael in Florence, and this is an important plate because it shows Raphael in Florence visiting the exposition of the models of Leonardo's Anghiari battle and Michelangelo Cassina battle, and so it underlines the importance of these two artists for the updating, for the growing of Raphael's career. And then the next one, you see Raphael in Rome at the present of Pope Julius II. And eventually you see the last one, Raphael depicting the Virgin at the present of Saint Luke. We know, we told it, this is a subject of Saint Luke life. It was Saint Luke that painted the Virgin appeared. But here Raphael takes Saint Luke place. In fact, the sources started to call him divine, and so this plate is very coherent with this image of Raphael that we had in the 19th century. There are also many paintings that portray scenes from the life of Raphael, and in particular, much attention was paid to his love affair with Fornarina. As you can see here, the French painter, the very famous French painter Ingres, during his stay in Rome, was strongly impressed from Raphael's work and life, as you can argue from this beautiful painting that shows the two lovers together. Also, less known artists dedicated themselves to these subjects. Giuseppe Sogni exposed in Brera in 1826 this painting that you see on the left side, Raphael and Fornarina, while 40 years later, again in Brera, Francesco Valaperta exposed this melancholic scene in which the painter is already ill and near his end, and he indulges in the embrace of the beloved woman. Even one of the greatest sculptors of the early 19th century in Rome, the Danish Bertel Thorvaldsen, did not fail to pay tribute to Raphael with several works, including this relief that depicts the glorification of Raphael, and which was made in 1833, when the whole Roman artistic world was thrilled by the alleged discovery of Raphael's bones in the Pantheon. The artist, as you can see, is portrayed in clothes inspired by his image in the painting of the Accademia di San Luca, in the St. Luke painting the Virgin that we seen previously. And he draws significantly sitting on ancient works. You can see here column, but above all, the three graces. Another typical subject of this kind of celebrative paintings or sculpture was Raphael's death. We end our story with this painting created by the French Bergeret and purchased by Napoleon. The scene reconstructs the display of Raphael's body on the day of his death, 37 years old, so quite young. As narrated by Vasari once again, the Transfiguration is placed at the head of the bed, and you can see here on the right. While the most important characters of the time, starting with Pope Leo X, pay homage to Raphael. There are other works by the painter in this room, such as the Madonna della Seggiola, and other characters who did not actually take part in the funeral, such as Michelangelo, that was not there, or Vasari himself, but Vasari was too young to be there. This painting so takes us back in time to April 6, 1520, but today, 500 years later, we can say, I think for sure, that Raphael is never dead. With his ideal beauty, He is still amazing us. He is still telling us every time something new, and maybe this is immortality. Thank you.